Thinking Out Loud with Dave Palmer. Here on Morning Joy, where truth matters.
Yes, welcome back to Morning Joy, where truth matters. I'm your host, Keith Downey. And in honor of April Fools, what does St. Thomas teach about folly and its counterpart, wisdom, in the Summa? That's a very good question. We got, of course, Dave Palmer to help us walk through it all. Good morning, Dave.
Good morning, Keith. Good to be with you. Happy April Fool's Day to you.
Yeah, right back to you. I was thinking about calling, or at least introducing the segment as Thinking Internally with St. John at the Cross, but that might have kind of went over people's head. I don't know.
Well, you played in so well into what I'm going to talk about today, because April Fool's Day is a very scary, dangerous day in so many ways, and I can tell that you're a prankster. It's like you're thinking about, should I do this? Should I do that? Maybe I should do this one. Maybe I should call my mother-in-law and play this joke. Maybe I should do something at work. And it's tricky because it takes a lot of prudence, and I am definitely a practical joker, and I love to play jokes on people. In fact, it's known in my family that no one in my family answers the phone or will hardly even talk to me on April Fool's Day, because they know that a joke is coming. And nobody in my mom, my sisters, they're just like, they don't even answer the phone. They won't respond to a text. They're just like, no, Dave, I will not have anything to do with you on April Fool's Day. And we've also done some classic April Fool's jokes at work. Sissel and I and the team, interestingly, we're not working today. We're off, and so we won't have an opportunity to do them, at least in the office. But I got some tidbits to tell you about folly, which is related to foolishness here on April Fool's Day. And St. Thomas Aquinas does talk about folly and its opposite, wisdom, in the Summa Theologia, but he didn't pull any April Fool's jokes in his lifetime that I'm aware of. And so I think the thing today, like I said, with April Fool's jokes, you got to be prudent. You got to really look at the circumstances. What is it? Is it going over the top? And prudence is a reason to action. Okay, it's an intellectual virtue, but the highest of the intellectual virtues, and also the highest of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, is wisdom. And the opposite of wisdom is folly. Okay, so you have to really, again, take a lot of discernment when you talk about what are you going to do as a joke, and what are you going to do to try to be funny on a day like this. All right. And also, St. Thomas Aquinas will say in the Summa that folly is a sin. And I'll also talk in a moment about what is the main cause of one falling into folly. But before that, I want to tell you, interestingly, I did some research last night, and I was trying to find out the origin of April Fool's Day. How did it all begin? And first of all, historians are not quite sure. You can go and do a search, and you can try to find out what was the origin of April Fool's Day. They don't quite know. They think it may go back to a poem that was written back in the 16th century, a Flemish poem, and all the different countries have seemed to pick up on it, because most countries have some kind of traditions having to do with April Fool's Day. The other irony of it is that they say if you do a search for the origin of April Fool's Day, a lot of the explanations are April Fool's. So the explanation of April Fool's Day is actually a joke itself. I want to give you an interesting example of an attempt at humor, an attempt at folly that I think backfired big time. Okay, and you may be familiar with a 16th century Renaissance Dutch Catholic priest. His name is Desiderius Erasmus. Have you heard of Erasmus? He's a pretty famous name.
No,
he was, by all measures, a very faithful Catholic. He was a very good friend of St. Thomas More, who we know is a martyr for the faith. They lived at the same time. They hung out with each other. But in 1511, and that date is very important because you can imagine what happened 6 years later after 1511 was the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Erasmus decides to write a book called In Praise of Folly, okay, In Praise of Folly. And what it was a satire, and it was a very satirical, funny attempt at humor, at looking at some of the traditions and the culture at the time, but especially the Catholic Church. So what he did was he took a very satirical look at some of the teachings of the Catholic Church, some of them that seemed kind of superstitious, some of them that seemed overly philosophical or metaphysical, and also a satirical look at some of the corruption and abuses in the church. And the book was narrated by a character called Folly, and he jokingly praises self-deception, madness, again, criticizes the teaching, some of the abuses in the Catholic Church. Her companions were self-love, flattery, forgetfulness, laziness. These were all kind of funny characters, right? And what happened was the book became incredibly popular. And one of the people who was a big fan of Erasmus was a guy named Martin Luther. And I'm not saying that Erasmus started the Protestant Reformation, but what he did by writing the book and trying to be funny in criticizing the Catholic Church and her teachings, and satirically criticizing some of the abuses and things like that in the Catholic Church, he might have just been one of the embers that threw into the fire in the early 16th century that led to the Protestant Reformation. So that might have been the biggest practical joke that backfired the biggest in the history of the church. I don't know if you're familiar with that story or not, Keith.
I am not.
That book?
No, this is great. I mean, well, not great, but it's very interesting to say the least.
Yeah. And I haven't read the book, but it's kind of sad. And even at the end of Erasmus's life, he did call into question whether or not it was in that book. Even the Pope at the time thought it was kind of humorous. So again, he was a faithful Catholic priest. He wasn't trying to do anything wrong. He's trying to be funny, poke fun at the Catholic Church. But I think in the end, maybe it wasn't such a good idea. Okay, so that's a big example. All right, so I'll go now to the Summa Theologian, what St. Thomas Aquinas writes about folly. And again, he in a big section of the Summa, he talks about the theological virtue of charity, but he talks about all the different virtues and gifts and things like that spin off from charity. And as I mentioned before, the highest of the gifts of the Holy Spirit is wisdom, and that's related to charity. And the opposite of the intellectual virtue and the gift of wisdom is folly. And so he says wisdom is the highest of the gifts, and the wise person judges things correctly because he discerns things properly at the highest degree. So you're almost looking at the world with the eyes of God. You're looking at first causes. You're very able to discern the big picture if you're a wise person, right? Prudence is discerning things at a lower level, okay? The fool or folly means stupor, dullness, apathy in the heart and in the senses. The fool does not judge things correctly due to his dullness and apathy, okay? So the opposite of the wise person. And then in the next articles, Thomas says, okay, is foolishness a sin? Is folly a sin? And he says, yes, it is a sin because a foolish man plunges himself into earthly things whereby his sense is rendered incapable of perceiving divine things. So what he's saying is that the fool gets all caught up in the world, caught up in the day-to-day, caught up in sensual pleasures, and he dulls his mind so that he's not able to lift his mind to the higher spiritual realities, and therefore he blocks himself off from being wise. Wow. Finally, the last thing he asks he says, is folly a daughter of lust? And so he's going to come to the conclusion that the greatest cause of folly is one who falls into lust. And he says it's caused by the spiritual sense being dulled so as to be incapable of judging spiritual things. Now, man's sense is plunged into earthly things chiefly by lust, which is about the greatest of pleasures. So the bottom line is, on a day like today, when you're trying to make decisions about which jokes you're going to play and, that kind of thing, you need to be prudent, you need to be wise, and you got to be careful about some of the other, one of the principal sins like lust that can lead you too much about the things below and not thinking about the things above, because that's when we start making stupid decisions and being foolish. So anyways, that's what St. Thomas Aquinas had to say about April Fool's Day, Keith.
Do you think St. Thomas Aquinas, and I don't know if it's in any of his writings, but do you think that he thought maybe that God had a sense of humor?
Oh, I think so. It's, there's not a lot of evidence that I'm aware of that St. Thomas Aquinas was, like a laugh a minute, or,
Sure.
what was he was such a deep thinker, but I'm sure he had a good sense of humor. But there's a very, and I'm not sure about what St. Thomas Aquinas would have said, but he did make comments about, having friends, and I think even about laughter and mirth. And I remember interviewing Dale Ahlquist one time, and I'll kind of close with this. And Dale Ahlquist is a great Chesterton expert, and Chesterton wrote a book called Orthodoxy. And at the end of Orthodoxy, he goes into this long explanation of this one quality of Jesus that didn't ever really come out in the Gospels, but which G.K. Chesterton was certain that Jesus would have had, even though it isn't really displayed very clearly. And you read it and you read it and read it, and finally he comes to the conclusion that it was mirth, is that Jesus was probably a much more mirthful person than we typically think. He did probably joke around. He probably did have a lot more fun. So anyways, I think God has to have a sense of humor. I mean, look at some of the creatures. Us. He created us, right? That shows that he has a sense of humor, doesn't it?
That's right. Wow. Well, thank you for breaking that down for us. Now, for all those out there, you can find more of Dave Palmer by simply listening or watching to Back to the Father, and that's every Friday at 1 p.m. Central on GRN Online YouTube. Thank you so much, Dave. And that is it for the very first hour of Morning Joy, where truth matters. Make sure to tune in tomorrow at this time, as Sissel Anderson will be joining us for her Fruitful Living segment. And for those that are unable to stick around for the remainder of this morning, we'll see you bright and early, 6 a.m. Central, 7 a.m. Eastern tomorrow. Until then, God bless. Make it a joyful day, especially today. But for those hanging around with us, we'll be joined by comedian Steve Simone, talking all about the small joys we can find during Lent and more right after this quick little break. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.
This has been Morning Joy, where truth matters, hosted by Keith Downey. Take some joy with you today. Visit grnonline.com/joy to listen again, share a segment, or answer the question of the day. That's grnonline.com/joy.